We begin with breaking news. A new report just released from the federal housing advocate, Marie-Josée Houle. She says Canada's growing homeless encampment population constitutes a human rights crisis. She criticizes the federal government for not meeting people's basic needs, and Houle is now calling for a national response and soon. This is one encampment CBC News visited in downtown Toronto, one of many that have popped up in the city in recent years. It's a trend that has spiked in major cities right across Canada, and there is mounting frustration from people who are experiencing homelessness, from activists, from community members, about what they say is a lack of action on an issue that is spiraling. Efforts are mainly being devoted to forcibly evicting people living in these tent cities. We begin with Megan Fitzpatrick, who is at that encampment in downtown Toronto. Megan, let's talk about this report just off embargo. What are the key takeaways from the housing advocate?
Well, you did mention one of them there, Heather. She's calling in this report a national human rights crisis is how she describes the rising number of encampments. And she does say that number has been rising in recent years, particularly since the pandemic, and that these kinds of encampments are being seen not just in big cities like here in Toronto, but smaller municipalities across Canada now, and more in rural areas of Canada. So about a year ago, she undertook this review, and it involved engaging with residents of encampments in cities across Canada, talking to advocates who work in this space, as well as representatives from organizations representing Indigenous Canadians. Her report, Heather, looks at this trend, this growing number of encampments that have been popping up, and why that is happening. Of course, at its very core, it's because of a lack of affordable and accessible housing, she says, but there are other reasons too. For example, in emergency shelters, they're often full. We know that's a problem here in Toronto, for example. Also, the conditions in shelters are not always suitable for people's needs. She talks about how discrimination plays into this as well for certain groups, like people with disabilities, again, for Indigenous people in Canada as well. And she says there's been a lack of coordination in terms of responding to homelessness in Canada, lack of coordination between levels of government, between different government agencies. And she says there's a lack of political will to address this situation. And she says stigma plays into that as well, negative perceptions about people experiencing homelessness. So she discusses the conditions that people face in encampments like the one behind me, some of the safety risks. But she also broadly throughout this report talks about the need to address homelessness with a human rights lens. She says essentially the human rights of people who live in these encampments are not being upheld. And so she is calling on all levels of government to respond to this.
She characterizes it as a human rights crisis, very strong in that characterization. And as you say, Marie-Josée Houle calling for a national response. So what exactly is she recommending in this new report, Megan?
Well, she doesn't want to see a national action plan, essentially a formal response plan, and she wants to see it done by the end of August. And she says that's around the time when most municipalities are formulating their plans for the winter season ahead. And so that would be an appropriate time to have this plan in place. So she is looking to the federal government to lead this effort, to convene meetings between the provinces and territories and municipalities to immediately start coming up with responses. One of those responses, though, she says, Heather, should not be evicting people from these kinds of encampments. Here's more of what she said about that.
We're seeing some places are criminalizing homelessness. This is not the solution. Groups need to build trust with the people living, experiencing homelessness to find, real solutions for them. And threatening people with fines or with jail, that's not a solution. It's also a very costly one. And it's also a costly one in terms of dignity.
So she's calling, of course, for permanent housing solutions and for that to be done much faster. The National Housing Strategy to be enhanced, that programs that fall under that strategy, Heather, should really focus on groups that are already disadvantaged. She also says in the meantime, municipalities should be providing the basic necessities of life for people that do live in these encampments. Access to food, heat during the winter. It's a pretty chilly morning out here, I can tell you this morning. So a range of solutions put forward in this report, and she is looking to the federal housing minister to respond to this report fairly quickly, Heather.
Megan, thank you very much. Megan Fitzpatrick from downtown Toronto.